Hi guys, it's Amy and welcome to the channel, or welcome back. I hope that you're doing well. Let me know how you're doing in the comments. It is almost the end of 2024 and I can't believe I'm saying those words. It is so crazy. This year has just flown by, especially the month of December. I feel like I just want to pump the brakes and enjoy the holidays. As we're kind of getting towards the end of the year, this is the time where we reflect on the books that we read. And I recently did my 5-star reads for 2024. You can go and check that out from last week. But today we're talking about my favorite genre, and that is fantasy books. Now these are all pretty much adult fantasy. They do kind of vary in subgenre as far as like high fantasy, low, cozy, fantasy romance, that sort of thing. But these are all pretty much adult fantasies. I do have a YA fantasy video that you could go and check out, but these are all of the fantasy books. I keep looking at my big pile that I've got over here. These are all of the fantasy books that I read in 2024, and I'm kind of going from least favorite to most favorite. So this is a really exciting list for me because I love this genre so much. So I'm excited to bring you my opinions and I'm excited to talk about them with you. So let's get into this list. Now, I don't have a hard copy of all of them, but you know that I will always show you the graphic. But my first pick is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. And this is a really interesting and pretty short book. It kind of is like a literary fantasy, in my opinion. It's more like literary fiction with some fantasy elements to it. But this is a very mysterious, kind of haunting sort of book, and I don't want to give too much away about it because it is definitely one that you want to go into blindly. But we are following a character who lives in this strange, mysterious house that is just like this giant labyrinth, and he's kind of dictating all the different things that he finds in the labyrinth. He is pretty much kind of alone in this big mysterious house. His journey kind of unfolds in these journal entries that he is making as he is dictating all of the things that he is finding. And it is a strange and weird place. But I don't want to give too much away other than that. I do have a review on Goodreads if you want to get a little bit more of it, but I don't want to give too much of it away. But this is such an interesting book. I rated this 4 stars. It is something that I feel like is not going to necessarily be for everybody, but I really enjoyed the kind of mystery element to this. As things are unfolding, you're realizing that maybe things aren't quite what they seem. And I really enjoyed that aspect about the book. It was very mysterious. I remember I was not feeling well at the time of reading this and was reading it late into the night, and it was definitely a little bit spooky. But it has some really interesting elements that I feel like would not necessarily be for everybody. It gets a bit like metaphysical and things like that. So just be aware of that. But if you want a sort of literary fiction fantasy with some really interesting prose that are told from a journal entry perspective, from this really sweet and innocent, kind of naive character in a weird, mysterious world, then I would probably recommend this to you. The next book on my list might be a little bit controversial that it's lower on my list, but it is The Sword of Kaigan by M.L. Wong, and I have really enjoyed M.L. Wong's writing. Both of her books are on my list for this fantasy list, but this is a little bit lower on my list, even though I did rate it 4 stars, but this is just such an intense read. We are following a woman named Masaki, whose family lives on this kind of remote island. It's a very like Japanese-inspired world, but she is married into this very like militaristic kind of sword-fighting family, but they also have like elemental magic as well. It is about war coming to their doorstep, basically. And even though this is like elemental, there's fighting, it is very much about personal and family trauma and different like difficult family and relationship dynamics. It's definitely about this mother's struggle with her personal identity as well as her identity as a mother and how she connects with her children and her husband, and how conflict definitely brings out difficulties, and it's like, how are we going to deal with this together? And there's just so much that happens in this book. And we read it for our book club, The Appendix, over on the Fable app. And I was reading it aloud with my husband. Everything that we read on The Appendix, we are reading, my husband and I, aloud together. He definitely didn't enjoy it as much as I did. And I definitely feel like that affected my enjoyment as well. But it definitely had some amazing character work in it. I was really blown away, but I feel like it took a while to get to that good character work. I felt like by the end, I was really getting the meat of it, but there are just some really traumatic things that happen in this book. It is, loss and grief, definitely abuse as far as marital abuse, even abuse within a family dynamic. There is SA in this book. There's just so much that happens in this, so definitely go and check out your trigger warnings. I know I've listed some of them, probably not all of them, but it is such an intriguing book where it's spanning from kind of the macro as far as like huge like government conspiracy, corruption and things like that, all the way down to the family dynamic and even to the individual as far as, identity and how you see yourself and believing in yourself. So it really spans a huge range of conflicts. And I really enjoyed that because she was able to put in so much nuance into all of these different situations that are really difficult. And somehow I feel like she did it really well, but it was still just such a heavy read in that I felt like there wasn't a lot of reprieve. And I will get to her other book later in this list. I feel like that book was a little bit better paced as far as trauma and reprieve and the ebb and flow and just being allowed to let things kind of breathe and have their moment and be able to kind of swallow what you're reading and be able to process it. I feel like there wasn't a lot of processing time, so that's more of my qualm with the book, but it was still such an amazing book. And if you want something that is very confrontive and challenging, but just so moving at the same time, I would definitely recommend The Sword of Kaigen. So far, I've talked about standalones, but I do have some series on here. And my next pick is One Dark Window from the Shepherd King duology. I am picking my favorite book out of these series to kind of show to you and feature. So I'm not necessarily talking about every single book individually. This list would take forever to get through if I did. But my favorite of the duology was the first book, and this is definitely a fast-paced kind of fantasy, and we definitely have some romance in there. I definitely think that the romance is a subplot, but it is definitely a feature of the book. We actually have a couple of different romance plots, especially in the second book. But this is a gothic, very atmospheric sort of fantasy about a girl who kind of has this magical curse, and she has this strange sort of dark being, this voice that lives in her head, and he kind of gives her magical abilities. And this is such an interesting world because we have kind of different magic systems where we have people who develop this sickness, like our main character, and they are able to gain these sort of magical abilities because of it. And that kind of magic is really looked down upon. I think it's because it is not really controllable. And then we have this sort of like tarot card, magical card magic system that is a bit more controllable. And everybody's wanting to obtain all these cards so they can have kind of the ultimate power. And there is a lot that happens in these books. It is definitely like fast-paced and easy to read. I would say it has like the ease of a YA sort of fantasy as far as the ease of the reading and the fast-pacedness of it, but it still maintains a mature tone. These do have some spice in there. There is more spice in the second book, but I just really love kind of the establishment of this world and the relationships that happen in the first book. I would definitely recommend the duology. It is a lot of fun. I read it kind of in the fall season, the spooky season, if you will, and I really enjoyed that. I feel like it was really atmospheric for that. And I don't know if I said I rated this 4 stars. There is definitely a lot of like interpersonal conflict and conflict within yourself. I feel like I feel like that's kind of a theme for the books that I've listed so far on this list. But we have just such a fantastic villain. You have characters that you love, characters that you love to hate, and it is just such a satisfying kind of read. So if that sounds up your alley, I would definitely recommend. Another series that I read is The Scholomance by Naomi Novik, and my favorite book of this series, this trilogy, was the third book, The Golden Enclaves. This is such a fun fantasy series where it is taking place at this kind of magical school, and even though we're dealing with teenagers, this is definitely an adult series. We're dealing with mature themes and things like that, but we are in this really chaotic magical school where there aren't actually any teachers. The magical school is like self-contained and you kind of are learning on your own. It is super competitive and sort of this cutthroat environment. There are these beasts that are always lurking around the corner. It is such a high tension, high stress environment to learn in. But we are following our main character, Elle, who is kind of a loner, and as she builds relationships and friendships, she kind of is learning more about herself. But she definitely is a loner in this situation, and she's had this kind of weird prophecy told about her that she's going to be this sort of evil reckoning for the magic world. Basically. And she's trying to fight that stigma about herself. But this is just such an interesting series. It is funny. It is absolutely hilarious. It's kind of some dry humor, sarcastic humor, and then just situational humor as well. And I really loved the third book because of the great conclusion that we got. There is definitely building lore and complex kind of politics that all kind of come together in this last third book. And I honestly felt like sometimes I wasn't necessarily enjoying the academic setting. It got a little bit mundane at times for me, but that is just my personal opinion. I still enjoyed it. It was still a lot of fun, but the third book is definitely a different situation. I don't want to give anything away about it, but everything just kind of comes to a head, and it's just a really fantastic conclusion and a really fun series. Now, my next book is actually a series that kind of spanned going from 2023 into 2024, but I finished the third book of the Shades of Magic trilogy, A Conjuring of Light by V.E. Schwab in January, I believe, in February. But I really enjoyed this series. It is definitely fun and fast-paced as far as fantasy series go, and I feel like I would definitely recommend this and like the Scholomance for beginning fantasy readers that want to get into series. But I really enjoyed this third book. I think the first book is probably my favorite, but I only read the third book in 2024, and I definitely feel like it deserves a place on this list. It was just a really great conclusion, but if you're not familiar with this series, we are in this kind of magical version of London, but we kind of have some alternate realities, and there's different versions of London, different versions of the world, but we're kind of based more in London. But we're following our main character, Kel, who is able to traverse through these different versions of London, and he's kind of the sort of spokesperson for the king between these different worlds. And Kel has these interesting magical abilities. There are different versions of the world that have different relationships with magic. There's one version that has like no magic at all. Kel's version of the world has magic, and then there is a third world that has kind of been decimated by magic. So we have some interesting conflicts that happen in this, and definitely between our main character Lila and Kel. Lila is kind of this chaotic sort of con woman giving kind of pirate energy. I really love that. There's definitely a pirate element in the second book of the series, but they are kind of thrown into this conflict together, and they're kind of having to solve these different issues where the magic is kind of trying to take over. And I don't want to give too much away about it, but this is just such a fun series. It is definitely like action-packed and fast-paced. Each book has kind of a different tone to it in that we're just kind of shifting in the conflict and how things are growing and evolving. And the second book has kind of more of like a magical competition feel to it. And then our third book, the one that I read in 2024, is kind of a culmination, of course, of everything. I just really enjoyed this series. It is a lot of fun. It's a really interesting magic system, and we definitely have some interesting relationships. There's a little bit of romance in here. There's not a ton. It's definitely like a subplot, but just kind of the high stakes and the fast-paced conflict in here is so intriguing. You have some really interesting villains in this world. And of course, it's seeing within a political system how people are kind of like getting in the way of the right thing happening because of fear, because of, oh, well, this is just how things have been done for so long. It's really interesting to see how everybody kind of responds to these different conflicts. Everybody is kind of having to pitch in and help in order to make things happen. So if that sounds interesting to you, I would definitely recommend. I definitely have to include a cozy fantasy on here, and I think my favorite of this year is Bookshops and Bone Dust by Travis Baldree. This is like the prequel to his Legends and Lattes book. And this is following our same main character, Viv, the orc. But this is like in a previous time in her life where she's injured on a job. She's kind of like this arms for hire sort of person. And she's injured on a job and kind of has to take respite in this small seaside town. And it's about how she just kind of is taking time to heal and how she befriends some of the townspeople. She befriends a bookshop owner who is a rat who kind of gives her book recommendations. And there's even a little bit of a love interest here. It's a sweet and super cozy book. It is very low stakes. There is some kind of conflict that happens, but it's nothing like major. But it's just a fun and cozy read. I read this for my 24-hour readathon. You can go and check that out on my channel if you want to get kind of my minute-to-minute perspectives on this book. It is just super cozy. It is super fun. I definitely think this would be really good, like, all year round, but definitely for, like, this cozy sort of winter time. I feel like this would be a really great read if you like cozy fantasy, but this is definitely probably my favorite cozy fantasy for the year. I've got another short book for you on this list, so you don't always have to get into these big, beefy fantasies. You can get some shorter fantasies. But this is actually even shorter than Piranesi. It is definitely a novella, and it is The Dead Cattail Assassins by P. DeJelly Clark. This is my first read of this author's, and I loved his writing so much. I definitely want to read more of his work. But this is exactly as the title says. We are following some undead assassins, specifically our main character, Evine, and she's part of this undead assassins guild where they're hired to assassinate people that are kind of causing conflict. There's definitely some mystery to that as well, but she goes on a job and things go not quite as planned, and she ends up kind of having to solve a strange mystery. And it is so chaotic. It is really funny. It is just such a romp of a book, but we kind of have some mythology in there, some really interesting magic. It's just a chaotic and fun time, and some really strange characters that she has to deal with. Some of the assassins are super strange and kind of hilarious. Again, this is just such a fun read. I definitely ate it up super fast. It definitely does have its like darker kind of cutthroat moments. There is violence in here, of course. We're dealing with assassins. It was just such a fun read, and I would definitely recommend. This has definitely been the year of Robin Hobb for me, and I am on her second series in her entire universe, The Realm of the Elderlings. And I've only finished one book from this series, but I absolutely loved it, and it had to be on this list. And that is the first book of the Live Ship Traders trilogy, The Ship of Magic. This is such an interesting read. It is very character driven, but we are following multiple POVs as they kind of interconnect into this story. And it is based around very like seaside towns and these traders who were trading on the high seas, and specifically these magical ships that are called live ships that literally are ships that come to life. And they are kind of within these trader families, they are passed down, and there has to be someone from the family connected to the ship in order for the ship to sail properly. But there is just so much interesting conflict that goes on. There really is not any one particular character that I really like or love in this series because everybody is a little bit infuriating. But I feel like that makes it really interesting. Everybody is flawed and conflicted. We are following so many different POVs and just how their relationships interconnect. And we definitely have some very interesting magic. I think the ships are probably my favorite part of the book because it is just so magical and interesting seeing them come to life. It requires 3 different people to die on the ship in order for the ship to awaken and come to life. So it's a very involved sort of process with these ships. It is just so magical and so interesting, so character driven, and Robin Hobb's character work, I think, is incomparable. Like, she just does such amazing jobs with her characters. They feel so real and are so conflicted. You are just so infuriated with them sometimes, but you feel for them. She definitely has hilarious moments as well, and her writing style is just so interesting. It definitely has the sort of old world feel to it. This is very much a kind of European inspired sort of fantasy. But it is just so much fun, and I definitely would recommend if you like the idea of something that is very character driven. My next book on this list is another kind of literary fantasy where it has some sort of magical realism elements to it, and that is A Short Walk Through a Wide World by Douglas Westerbeek. I know I have preached this book a lot on this channel, and I wish I saw more people talking about it because it is such an incredible book. This is definitely a 5-star read for me from this year. It is following a woman who has this disease where her body will shut down if she doesn't kind of stay on the move. So it is kind of this journey around the world several times over, and all of the adventures that she has, and just kind of the lonely life that she sort of leads. I feel like this is a little bit reminiscent of The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, but I really didn't like that book. I feel like this is a much better take on kind of a person who is kind of living this lonely, sort of immortal kind of life. And I feel like it just had a better look at like being able to experience all these different adventures and being all around the world, that sort of thing. So I would definitely recommend if you like the idea of like adventures with a little bit of like a fantasy realism, magical realism element to it, and you're willing to explore a kind of lonely character and how she connects with people. There are relationships that she develops with people, but nothing can really be long term just because she can't really stay in one place. But she is just able to experience so many interesting and magical things, and I definitely loved this book. Now, getting into some more series. This is actually an ongoing series. The second book is coming out in 2025, but I absolutely love this book. It is kind of a mystery fantasy, and it is called The Tainted Cup by Robert Jackson Bennett. I really enjoyed this book, and I definitely want to read more of his work. I have his book, The Foundry Side, on my shelf, but I've just heard really great things about his other books. But this is kind of like a take of Sherlock Holmes in a fantasy world. And our Sherlock character is female, but we're getting the story told just like the Sherlock books. We're getting it told by the Watson character perspective. But our characters are members of the military in this kind of dark and brooding world where there is really interesting, kind of like sci-fi inspired magic. And there are these great Leviathan beasts that are on kind of the borders of the world in the sea that are threatening to kind of overtake and bring destruction. There's just so much going on, but we are definitely solving a murder mystery in this. And so our main characters are trying to figure out what is going on with these people who are dying because these trees are exploding from them. It is definitely strange, but so intriguing. There is definitely some political intrigue in here. It's kind of a militaristic political world, and there's just so many interesting nuances within this political system. It is definitely a dark and mysterious sort of world, but if you like the idea of Sherlock Holmes in a fantasy world, I would definitely recommend. Okay, we are getting into the top 5 of this list, and these are all 5-star books for me. I absolutely loved them. And my 5th pick on this list is Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. This is my 2nd Sanderson book. I read his book, The Tress of the Emerald Sea, and I've heard that that is very different from his other work, and I'm glad because I didn't necessarily like that book, but I loved Mistborn. It is so good. It definitely is more like fast pace and almost has a YA feel, but it still is mature with its themes and the violence. It is such an interesting world with this metal-based magic system, and it is about a rebellion against a dictator who has been ruling for 1,000 years and oppressing his people. And we're following our main character, Vin, who discovers that she is one of these magic users, a Mistborn, and how she becomes a part of this rebellion. And it is just so intriguing and fast-paced. It is definitely heart-wrenching at times. I definitely love our kind of main characters, the perspectives that we're getting. We're getting the perspective of Vin and also our kind of rebellion leader, Kelsier. And Kelsier is such an amazing character. He's so great. But there are just so many interesting politics that are happening in this world. And the magic that is in this world, there is the metal-based magic, but there's still more kind of magic on the outskirts that I feel like we're going to find out more about in the following books. Again, this is my only book from this series that I have read, and I am dipping my toe into the Cosmere, and so far I'm loving it, but I definitely need to continue with this series. I finally got my husband to read this book, and I think he's almost done with it, but he is like, it is so good. And now that we're both on the Mistborn train, I feel like I need to pick the series back up in January. In this book, I feel like Sanderson does a really good job of not just like info dumping as far as the world building. It is building as we're kind of learning with our main character, Vin. And definitely with the magic system, the allomancy, I feel like he does a really great job of reinforcing understanding throughout the book. So you're not having to pay what I call the fantasy tax, where you're having to kind of get through all this world building and just kind of an info dump. The fantasy tax on this one is pretty low that you're having to pay because you are getting reinforced understanding and explanations throughout the book. And personally for me, I just appreciate that. I feel like a fantasy author who can do that well without confusing me, giving me enough detail to keep me going and building on it, I feel like is a real skill. So I definitely want to promote books that have that kind of writing, but I'm fine with an info dump. I really am. I'm willing to pay the fantasy tax. I would consider this kind of better for the kind of beginner to intermediate fantasy reader, which I would consider myself more intermediate. I'm still on my fantasy journey and learning the kind of things that I like, even though I have read more complex fantasies with the info dump that are very complex, which I'll get to more on this list. But this, I feel like, is a great entry into his whole universe, the Cosmere. And I know there's so much hype right now about his latest book, Wind and Truth, from the Stormlight Archive, but you've got to work up to that. And I've heard people say that you can read the Stormlight Archive without having read the previous books, like Mistborn, Mistborn Era 2 and all of that, the Standalones. I personally want to read the rest of his books because I've heard that it just gives so much more depth to the world. So if you're wanting to get into the Cosmere, I would recommend starting with Mistborn. So my 4th book on this list is The Mask of Mirrors, which is the first book of the Rook and Rose trilogy by M.A. Carrick. And I've read 2 books from this series so far. I need to read the 3rd book, The Labyrinth's Heart. But the first book of this trilogy was my favorite. I think most people, the second book is their favorite. I personally just really liked the first book. This is such a complex world, and I think because the authors, it's actually a writing duo, but the writing duo, because we're getting two different brains and ideas coming together, I feel like it creates the complexity of this world. And it is so politically complex, the magic is complex. I definitely am having to go back to the glossary and the character list. There's so many characters in this book. So if that would deter you, I would not recommend this. I think it is so fantastic. I think this is a really great fantasy to get into if you're more like intermediate to advanced as far as your fantasy reading. But we are following our main character, Rin, in this sort of Venetian-inspired world. It feels very much like Venice, Italy, in that there's all these like rivers and channels throughout the city. But Rin is navigating her sort of journey in this city as she is conning this wealthy noble family, trying to con them out of their wealth in order to help herself and her sort of like adoptive orphan siblings. There is such a interesting political system. We kind of have like a council and all of these noble families that are able to have these different charters where they're in charge of different parts of the trades and just different elements of the government. And you can be adopted into these families, and there are so many families and each one is playing a different role. So everybody is trying to put their foot into the world and be a part of this. Ren is just trying to navigate the world and get some money for her and her siblings. But she is navigating having like multiple aliases, and there's just so much that happens in these books. The magic is definitely complex and interesting as well. A numerology based magic where everything is kind of like you have to write it out in these symbols and everything. The different numbers and symbols translate to different gods with different powers, but it is still like really ambiguous. It is an interesting magic system for sure, but we also have kind of a tarot card based magic system, and Rin kind of dabbles in that herself. It's very tarot based where, you know, it's predicting the future or reading the past and that sort of thing. And as you read throughout the series, you kind of see how maybe the different magic systems kind of come together. So it's so intriguing, and I just really enjoy how much depth and complexity there is to this world, even though it is a bit ambiguous. You definitely love the characters. We have crime lords, we have like vigilantes, we have corrupt nobles, we have, of course, our con woman main character who I absolutely love. And there's just so much richness and depth to this world and to these books. Again, I've read 2 of the books from this trilogy, and it just builds and complicates even more, and I can't wait to find the conclusion in the 3rd book, but definitely would recommend if you like a complex fantasy. Okay, we are into number 3, and I am so excited to talk about this book. This is the other M.L. Wong book that I read this year, and it is Blood over Brighthaven. This is definitely a book that explores some intense themes, which I feel like is kind of M.L. Wong's bread and butter. But I feel like this is very different from the Sword of Kaigen in that her writing style is still intense, but I feel like the story ebbs and flows better, where the different intense moments get to breathe a little bit more and the story sort of ebbs and flows. But we are following our main character, Siona, I believe that's how you pronounce it, and she is a mage in this magical city where everything is literally run by magic, like down to the electricity. And she is in this university system, and she is auditioning to become a high mage, this sort of like higher up researcher in her university. But this is a very misogynistic society. Women are only allowed to audition every 10 years. Only one woman is allowed to audition, and no woman has ever been able to become a high mage. But Siona is able to pass the test, and she is the first woman to become a high mage. But she is met with so much conflict. Again, this is a very misogynistic society. She's even given an assistant who is actually a janitor of this university. But as she does her research, she discovers some really dark secrets about the world. But we are exploring themes of like political corruption and even prejudice and sort of systematic prejudices within like a university system, academic systemic racism and prejudice. We're experiencing, again, racism just like as a society. There are these marginalized groups. Our janitor character, he is definitely a main feature, and he is part of this marginalized group and just how he's navigating the world. But you are really going on a journey with your main character, Siona, as she is very privileged, even though she has her own issues she's having to deal with being a woman in this society. But she really goes on this kind of like identity crisis and really questioning her own morals and what she has believed and wanting to do what is right and not just do what she has always known because of the secrets that she finds out. This definitely explores religious controversy as well. The systems that we have in place, even though that's how it's always been done, what we've always believed, maybe some of the roots of those beliefs and the things attached to it, the way that things are done, are not necessarily right. I don't want to give too much more away about it, but it definitely explores these intense themes. It is definitely violent. It is definitely dark at times, but my goodness, it is so worth the read. It is something that just is really confrontive and challenging, and I really love that about it because it was just done in such a beautiful way. I feel like M.L. Wong, in this sort of like dark academia fantasy sort of setting, is able to explore these themes in a way that it's palatable in that, oh yeah, I'm reading a fantasy book, but it is so relevant, I feel like, for today, in that we should ask questions and we should do our own research, and it is just so fascinating. I absolutely love this book, and it definitely deserves the third position on my list. Now, my second book on this list kind of snuck up on me here at the end of the year. I actually finished it just a couple of days ago, and I'm so glad that I did. This was 5 stars. I honestly want to give it 6 stars. It was so good, and that is The Will of the Many by James Islington. This is an amazing book. When I finished it, I texted my husband with like the mind-blowing emojis, and I was like, oh my God, this book is so amazing. And I was like, you have to read this. So I believe he's going to be reading this next after Mistborn. But I can't say enough about this book. This is a Roman-inspired fantasy where we are in a world where this government called the hierarchy is basically trying to colonize the entire world. But it's called the hierarchy because we literally have kind of a tier ranking system where the higher up you are, the more will or magical power you're able to receive. And basically people are ceding to you this will, and because you're higher up, the more people are ceding to you. So you're basically getting like thousands of people's, a percentage of thousands of people's power if you're like really high up on this list. There's an 8-to-1 octavie at the bottom, princeps are at the top, but an octavie is basically someone who is like imprisoned. But a lot of people like who are like senators and higher ups in this system are positions from like 6 to 5 to 4. So you can be really powerful even within the middle of this system. But we are following our main character, Vice, who is from a nation that was taken over by the hierarchy. And basically he lost his entire family, and he is having to navigate secretly within this new kingdom. It is such a journey that we go on with Vice. He is basically, again, an orphan. He's living in an orphanage. He's working a job. He's 17. You know, he's just a kid. He's just a kid, but he definitely feels like an adult. He's had to grow up really fast. But he is discovered by someone who is a higher up in the hierarchy system, and he is wanting to adopt him and send him to this sort of like training academy for like the higher up in society, where they train to become senators and different high positions within this system. He believes that there is corruption in this academy. There is something very nefarious going on. And so he wants to basically adopt Vice and sponsor him in order to kind of suss out what the situation is. So we are getting kind of like training to be able to be a part of the academy because there are very high standards. And then we're being in the academy as we're training. And it definitely feels like a war college for teenagers. I feel like that's the best way to describe it. There is a lot of physical training, but there's also a lot of academic training as well. But you're studying like politics and war. You're studying, you know, how to take over these societies, how to deal with receiving will, what you can do with it, history. So it definitely feels like a war college. But as Vice is like navigating this academy, he is making friends. He's trying to hide his identity. There is so much going on, but it is intense. Even just from the beginning of the book, there is some like really violent things that happen. So just be aware of that. It can be violent and definitely graphic at times, but it is just this cutthroat sort of world. It is a very greed-based society, and Vice is trying to really like hold on to his true self, who he was raised to be. Just seeing the emotional journey that Vice has to go on is definitely like a first perspective look at someone who's had to deal with your nation being taken over by another. And it is heart-wrenching at times, the things that he has to experience. You know, it's like no one should have to go through that. And I feel like it is just written so well. You know, Vice, as far as like a character, you kind of grow to love him, but he is so like reserved as far as what he puts out there. Like it's definitely a lot of his inner monologue because he's having to plan like 3 steps ahead, the things that he says and the things that he does in order to portray a certain character as he's kind of trying to hide in this society. And you know, he's trying to protect himself, and it's just so interesting, like the things that he thinks about, the things that he has to plan out. If you like the idea of exploring like colonialism in this sort of Roman-inspired world that is definitely like cutthroat, I would recommend. Also, if you like the idea of like an academy training setting where there's a lot of physical training and there is academic training, but that's definitely not a feature where I feel like you have to understand a lot. It's just stuff that's kind of like mentioned. I feel like we're going to get more understanding as the series goes on. This is the first book and the only book that is out in this series so far. I'm not sure when the next book is coming out. So if you don't want to read a series that has not been completed, I don't know if I would recommend this, but I would really recommend this. It was so fantastic and definitely deserves the number 2 spot. All right, guys, we are at the top of the list. My number 1 spot. Can we get a drum roll, please? It is Royal Assassin, the second book of the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb. I started my Robin Hobb journey last year in 2023 with our book club, The Appendix, over on the Fable app. I continued it into 2024 and I absolutely love Robin Hobb. And Royal Assassin is probably the best book that I've read in quite some time. It is next to The City of Brass from the Daevabad trilogy for me. But I feel like the second book, Royal Assassin, it was kind of like a culmination of a lot of things that were happening in the first book that were being established in Assassin's Apprentice, and it just kind of came to a head. And we still have our conclusion of the third book. The third book wasn't necessarily my favorite because it was definitely different paced, but in Royal Assassin, you're getting all of the politics and intrigue, and everything just comes to like this real like high point tension that has to be resolved within the third book. It's just such an amazing fantasy world. If you're not familiar with it, we are following our main character Fitz, who is the illegitimate son of a prince in this world, and basically his journey trying to navigate life as he is sort of accepted into his family. His grandfather basically allows him to be a part of living in the castle, and he's in the care of one of like the stablemen. He's basically in charge of the stables and everything. But it's about him navigating life within his family, being a part of like the court, kind of being rejected, but also being trained to be an assassin. And we have really interesting politics, of course. It's very like court politics. It feels very like medieval fantasy, very European inspired. It's about how like trade is affected by politics. It's about the corruption within these politics. And it's also about how magic is affecting this world. We have a really interesting magic system that is very like mental based. And the way that it is used is just so interesting. There's a complicated relationship with magic. There's basically this mental magic that's basically passed down through the noble family. There's also a version of it where you're able to like connect with animals, but that is really looked down upon. I don't want to get too much into it. I don't want to give too much away, but Fitz is such a fascinating character. I love Fitz. There's another character that I really love, the Fool, who's more of a side character, but he definitely plays a big part in these stories. But Fitz is so lovable. You're starting out with him like at age 6 and spanning into him being like in his teens. I think he's like 16 or 17 by the time the series ends. But he just goes on such an emotional journey. Just the things that he has to go through, the things that you get really frustrated with him about. He definitely makes some dumb decisions as the story goes. But I've said it before, I said it with the Live Ship Trader series. Robin Hobb's character work is incomparable. She is able to write characters that feel so real because of how flawed they are, but how lovable, relatable they are at the same time. And I honestly don't know if anyone could ever compare to that kind of writing. And that's a really big thing to say. And because her universe is so big, I want to be able to get through all of it, but I know that I will be so devastated by the time that it ends. So I really am enjoying taking my time through it. And it's been a really unique experience because, again, we've been reading it with our book club, the appendix. But again, I read these books aloud with my husband, and being able to like live react with someone, especially with a book like this where you are just like, oh my God, as you're reading, it is such a special experience. We are commentating back and forth about different things that characters are doing and, the plot twists and all of that. And it is such a special experience. I would definitely recommend. I know at least like being able to buddy read. I know not everybody is going to read a book aloud like this. People are probably going to want to read a little bit faster than I am, but at least have a buddy read that you can do. But if you want to be a part of our journey and reading the Live Ship Traders, reading Robin Hobb, definitely join our book club. But you definitely need to start Robin Hobb with the Farseer trilogy. I've seen people recommend that you can read Live Ship Traders without Farseer, but there is definitely some lore and understanding that you're going to miss out on if you don't read the Farseer trilogy. So definitely start Robin Hobb with the Farseer trilogy. Royal Assassin is definitely my favorite fantasy book of the year. It is fast-paced, it is chaotic, it is super frustrating at times, but it is an amazing read. And the ending, oh my God. I feel like my top two books, The Will of the Many and Royal Assassin, had endings that just had my jaw on the floor. It was like just mind-blowing. You get more of the conclusion in the third book with Assassin's Quest, but it is heart-wrenching, it is funny at times, it just is all of the emotions in one book. And I loved that about it, that Robin Hobb could take me on such a journey and make me experience all of these different emotions, all these different adventures. It was incredible. So you definitely need to read the Farseer trilogy, and let me know if you have read it, which book of the trilogy is your favorite. Okay guys, I know that this was a big list and a lot to get through. I am definitely gonna have an interesting time editing this because there's so much footage, but I hope that you enjoyed this, and I hope that you got something from this list that you can add to your TBR. But definitely let me know if you've read these and what you thought about them. Let's talk about it in the comments. I love chatting books with you, especially ones that I enjoyed and loved, and getting to love them with you. But let me know what your favorite fantasy read was for 2024, or maybe some of your top ones if you couldn't pick a favorite. But I hope that you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope that you have a very great holidays. I'm not sure how my posting will go through the rest of the year. My husband is having some medical procedures done. Hopefully we'll be able to connect with you guys soon, and hope that you enjoyed this list. Again, happy holidays, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye!